A simple man denied boarding first class. What happened after he made a call will shock you. The terminal buzzed with early morning tension. The kind of hush that lives beneath chatter, suitcases rolling, boarding announcements. It was a normal day, at least for most. John stood in line, his presence quiet, almost invisible. His clothes were plain, well-worn jeans, a faded button-up, and a canvas shoulder bag. He moved with the ease of someone who'd traveled often, that you wouldn't guess it by looking at him. No designer luggage, no polished shoes, no expensive watch. Just a man, calm and patient. When it was his turn at the counter, he offered a polite smile and handed over his ticket. Before we go further, please ensure to like, share, and subscribe for more interesting stories like this one. The woman behind the desk barely glanced at it before her eyes flicked up to meet his. Her expression shifted, subtly, but unmistakably. A mixture of disbelief and irritation flashed across her face. She didn't scan the ticket. She didn't ask a question. Instead, she straightened her back and said, with the kind of authority used to shut doors rather than open them, "Sir, this line is for first-class passengers only." John blinked, unsure if he'd misheard. "Yes," he replied gently. "This is my ticket." She didn't look down. "First class only," she repeated, louder this time, so others could hear. "You'll need to use the economy check-in." A few heads turned. He took a slow breath, his fingers still holding out the paper. "I believe it's a first-class ticket," he said, still calm, still giving her the benefit of the doubt. With a short, dismissive exhale, she looked at the boarding pass again, but only briefly, as if the act itself annoyed her. "This must be a mistake," she muttered, setting the ticket aside. She gestured vaguely toward the far end of the terminal. "You'll need to check over there." He didn't move. He wasn't angry. That would have made things easier. He just stood still, eyes steady, not challenging, but not retreating either. "Could you just scan it?" he asked. She hesitated, then shook her head. "Sir, please don't hold up the line." It wasn't just a refusal. It was dismissal, and that landed harder than any raised voice could have. Behind him, someone coughed awkwardly. A couple murmured to each other. The atmosphere thickened. This wasn't about a ticket anymore. It was about how people saw each other, or how they didn't. John stepped aside, letting the next passenger through. He didn't argue, didn't plead. He simply walked to a quiet corner near the window, away from the crowd but within sight of the counter. He reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. His hands moved slowly, deliberately. No signs of frustration, only thought. His thumb hovered for a moment before he tapped a number from his favorites. The phone rang once before it was answered. He spoke with the quiet confidence of a man who rarely needed to repeat himself. "It's me," he said. "I think it's time." He ended the call and returned the phone to his pocket. Outside, a plane taxied across the tarmac. Inside, the line moved forward. The check-in agent continued her work, unaware of the ripple just set in motion. John waited. Not for permission, not for apology. He waited because he knew what came next. Before the morning at the airport, before the dismissive glance and the ticket refused, there was a boy in a small town with a head full of questions and a heart wired for quiet determination. John grew up where cornfields ran longer than main streets, and neighbors knew each other by first name and favorite pie. His house sat at the edge of a road that turned to gravel, framed by a mailbox that leaned slightly, like it had something to say. His father worked maintenance at the local grain mill. His mother was a librarian, fond of old stories and small wonders. John wasn't loud. He was the kind of kid who listened more than he spoke, who'd rather take apart a toaster than play catch. He spent hours at the library, fingers tracing diagrams, eyes widening over anything that ticked, blinked, or turned on. His first computer came from a garage sale, 1990 slow, dust in the fan, one key missing. He restored it before he turned 12. It wasn't just machines that fascinated him. It was the language they spoke. Lines of code made sense to John the way sheet music speaks to a pianist. He wasn't taught. He uncovered, like truths waiting beneath the surface. By high school, he was building rudimentary software for local businesses. The florist's inventory tracker. The mechanic's billing system. Nothing fancy, just simple, functional tools that saved time and cut headaches. People paid him in cash, pies, and thank yous. He never asked for more. He earned a scholarship to a mid-tier university. The kind of place smart kids go when they can't afford Ivy League tuition but still burn with ambition. In college, he didn't blend in. He wasn't at the parties, didn't chase trends, barely even spoke in class. But professors started hearing his name in the lab. He worked nights, built apps, published bug fixes for open-source systems. When others slept, he debugged. While most students hunted internships, John coded a platform, an automation tool for small aviation logistics. He saw how airlines struggled with scheduling, fuel planning, and real-time routing. While others saw inconvenience, John saw inefficiency screaming for optimization. He called it SkyPath, a quiet launch, just him and one friend from the dorms. They graduated. Others took jobs. John didn't. He rented a 2-room apartment and built a server farm from scratch using discarded parts. SkyPath began to grow, first with regional jet services, then with charter operators. Word spread quietly through forums and message boards. Aviation managers liked how it worked: lightweight, accurate, surprisingly intuitive. Within 5 years, major airlines were calling him. They didn't know the founder still repaired his own servers and coded support updates himself. They just knew their systems had become faster, smarter, cheaper. John's software became the invisible backbone of over a dozen airline operations across 3 continents. Scheduling, maintenance alerts, route optimization, even customer interface layers, all powered by John's vision. But power didn't change him. He never moved into glass towers or wore tailored suits. He didn't brand himself. No social media, no keynote speeches. When industry magazines wrote profiles, they ran stock photos because they couldn't find any recent ones. John believed in building quietly. Let the product speak. He became a mentor to young coders, particularly those overlooked by traditional education systems. He funded labs anonymously, paid tuition for students he never met. He visited tech schools unannounced, sat at the back of classrooms just to listen. He wasn't chasing influence. He was building the kind of world he wished he'd had when he was starting out. Still, people judged. Often. Once, at a conference he was invited to headline. Unbeknownst to most attendees, security stopped him at the door. He didn't have the look, didn't have the badge out. A junior staffer had to vouch for him. He gave his keynote anyway. The room applauded. The guards didn't recognize him until they saw his name on screen. But John never corrected people's assumptions. He understood them. Respect, he believed, wasn't something you demanded. It revealed itself in time. That belief was tested again the day he walked into the airport with a first-class ticket in his hand and the weight of his name deliberately hidden. He could have had an assistant book the flight, could have used a corporate ID, could have worn the badge of his success like armor. But he didn't. He never did. He traveled like anyone else because that's how he wanted to be seen. Just a man in transit, no fanfare. So when the woman at the counter waved him off without scanning his name, she wasn't just refusing service. She was confirming a world John had seen many times before, where appearance eclipsed substance, where assumptions shut doors before truth could speak. Still, he didn't react. Not yet. Because John knew that identity wasn't proven in moments of recognition, but in how you handled being overlooked. His greatness wasn't in the code he wrote, but in how he wore his achievements lightly. A billionaire in thrift store denim. A systems architect who could outthink CEOs but still opened the door for janitors. A man who had quietly, methodically, changed the way modern aviation worked, yet had no need to be thanked. He stood near the window after the denial at the counter, phone in hand, the world still unaware. But that would change soon, because beneath that soft-spoken demeanor lived precision, patience, and a kind of justice that never rushed, but never missed its moment either. The hum of fluorescent lights filled the airline's back office, a space not meant to impress, only function. Desks cluttered with files, coffee-stained paperwork, screens flickering with flight schedules and delays. It was a room built for routine. Supervisor Linda Walker sat slouched at her desk, scrolling through yesterday's passenger complaint reports. Most were minor: lost luggage, long security lines, someone upset about a missed upgrade. Her job didn't surprise her anymore. Nothing ever did. Then the phone rang. She almost didn't answer. It was the line few called directly, usually reserved for high-level inquiries or executive matters. Still, she picked up, pressing the receiver to her ear with a sigh. Airline operations, this is Walker. The voice on the other end was calm. Too calm. Good morning. I'm calling on behalf of Mr. John Ellis. She sat up. Her pen stopped moving. I'm sorry. Who? John Ellis, the voice repeated. The name hit like a silent thunderclap. Walker's free hand gripped the armrest. She glanced at her monitor, as if expecting confirmation to flash across the screen. It didn't. But she already knew. Her voice shifted, faltering slightly. Yes, sir. Of course. Where is he located? Gate 17. The line went dead. She lowered the phone slowly, her mind racing. There were names in this industry, ones you heard but never expected to cross paths with. John Ellis was one of them. Not a celebrity, not publicly. But inside these walls, he was a legend. The man behind the very system their airline depended on. The one who had, by sheer brilliance and relentless work, redefined aviation logistics. And he was sitting at Gate 17. Unnoticed. Disrespected. Walker didn't waste another second. She reached for the radio clipped to her belt. This is Supervisor Walker. Immediate response to Gate 17. Executive status. Repeat. Executive status. I want all senior ground staff en route now. We have a situation. She didn't explain. There wasn't time. Around her, heads turned. A few junior staffers exchanged puzzled glances, trying to decode the urgency. But those who understood the name didn't need translation. Walker stood, smoothing her blazer, the weight of the moment suddenly crushing the air around her. The system John Ellis had built ran quietly, like good code should. It kept planes on time, helped routes flow efficiently, and flagged mechanical issues before they became problems. But it had one more function, a rarely used executive alert system buried deep in its core, accessible only to a handful of people. Walker had just been activated by it. Down the hall, another phone rang. Then another. Someone was calling legal. Someone else was already notifying the director of operations. The dominoes had begun to fall. While the chaos brewed in the back corridors, John remained seated near the terminal window, away from the boarding line. He looked calm, almost serene. But the ripple he'd sent was moving fast, invisible to the passengers sipping coffee and checking watches. At Gate 17, the staff still moved with the casual indifference of routine. The agent who had dismissed John continued checking passports, unaware her morning was about to unravel. Inside the operations center, Walker pulled up security footage from the gate, locating John on screen. There he was, still waiting, still unbothered. But she knew better than to mistake his silence for passivity. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a failure of recognition, of values. And it had consequences. She keyed her mic again. Do not engage with the passenger until instructed. Executives are on their way. Security to remain at a distance unless called. Let me be clear, do not escalate this further. Copy that, came the response. She took a breath, steadying herself. Her career had never brushed up against someone like him before. This wasn't about PR damage or protocol. It was about respect, the kind earned through decades of work, the kind that shouldn't have to be proven at a check-in counter. And somewhere, beneath the mechanics of procedure, there was something else, a quiet sense of shame, because someone like John Ellis shouldn't need a title to be treated decently. And yet, here they were, scrambling only after a name had been revealed. Outside, boarding for another flight was called. Overhead, engines roared on the runway. Walker turned toward the exit, steps already quickening. Gate 17 was waiting. And so was John. The line at Gate 17 moved steadily, a rhythm of passports scanned, bags rolled forward, boarding passes torn with mechanical repetition. The attendant stood behind the counter, brisk and indifferent, her expression carved from routine. She hardly looked at the faces, just flicked her eyes from ticket to screen and waved them through. John sat a short distance away, still and unbothered. Not watching her, not watching the gate. Just waiting, like someone who knew what patience could summon. The first executive arrived breathless, eyes sweeping the terminal with urgency. Two more followed, all three in suits creased by haste. Their pace slowed only as they reached the counter, standing just far enough to draw attention, but close enough for her to hear. "Where's Mr. Ellis?" the lead one asked. The attendant blinked. "Who?" "John Ellis." A pause. Her lips parted. The name meant nothing to her until she saw the expression on his face. It wasn't anger. It was dread. And it spread quickly. She turned, scanning the crowd, confused. Then she pointed toward the man she had waved away earlier. "Him," she said, uncertainly. "That's the one. I thought he—" She didn't finish. She couldn't. The moment stretched. Her face lost its color. Not from fear of consequence, but from the slow crawl of understanding. She hadn't just turned away a man with a first-class ticket. She had dismissed someone her company depended on, someone whose name carried more weight than the uniforms on her shoulders. One executive was already walking toward John. The others stood back, their presence enough to shift the mood of the space. Conversations dropped to whispers. Eyes followed the unfolding scene like spectators to a story they didn't quite understand yet, but felt the gravity of. The man reached John and paused, hands clasped in front of him, spine slightly bent. Not groveling, not dramatizing, just honest reverence. "Mr. Ellis," he said, his voice low, respectful. "Please accept our deepest apologies. There has been a misunderstanding." John looked up. There was no anger in his eyes. No wounded pride. Just clarity. The kind that doesn't need to raise its voice. He nodded once. The silence around them deepened. No outburst, no need to recount what had happened. Everyone who mattered knew. Behind the counter, the attendant's posture changed. Shoulders drawn tight, hands now fumbling with a boarding pass she wasn't reading. Her voice caught as she stepped forward. I didn't realize," she said, barely audible. "If I had known." John turned to her slowly. His gaze wasn't cruel. It wasn't even stern. It simply held her there, stripped of excuses, left only with the weight of her own judgment. "That's the point," he said softly. She opened her mouth, but no apology felt sufficient. None would be. The damage hadn't been to his status, it had been to the invisible thread that ties human worth to simple dignity. And in that moment, it wasn't his title that made her uncomfortable. It was the mirror he held up to her assumption. John stood, not with force, but with purpose. The executive beside him motioned for a team member. "Ensure Mr. Ellis is escorted to the lounge, and upgrade the rest of his itinerary." John paused. No need for that. A final nod. He adjusted the strap of his worn canvas bag and walked toward the boarding gate, as passengers stepped aside without being asked. Power had never been about making noise. It had always been about knowing when silence says more. The cabin doors hissed open as John stepped aboard, flanked by silence. There was no announcement, no red carpet, just a quiet shift in the air. Conversations paused. Heads turned. Recognition flickered. Passengers in first class, already settled into leather seats, murmured softly to each other. Not loud enough to break etiquette, but enough to say something's happening. Some had seen the executives who escorted him in. Others had read the post that was already beginning to ripple across social platforms. A few simply sensed that the man now being seated among them was someone they probably should have noticed earlier. John moved without fanfare. He took his seat by the window, setting down the same worn canvas bag he'd carried from the gate. Nothing about him matched the gloss of first class. No silk tie, no polished shoes, no attitude groomed for performance. And yet, he belonged there more than most. A minute passed before she entered. The same attendant who had refused to scan his ticket earlier now appeared in the aisle, a silver tray trembling slightly in her hands. Champagne flutes chimed softly against each other. She approached him, gaze low, and extended the offering. "Your welcome drink, sir." Her voice was strained, controlled, as if each syllable was a delicate balance of professionalism and apology. Her hands didn't stop shaking. John looked up. His eyes met hers. There was no malice in them, no triumph, but the disappointment was unmistakable. She held his gaze for a second longer than she meant to, long enough to realize that it wasn't his words she feared, it was his silence. He accepted the glass with a nod. "Thank you." Nothing more. She retreated quickly, back into the galley. Her absence left behind a stillness that felt louder than any confrontation could have been. John sat back and turned to the window. The tarmac lay spread beneath a soft evening light, orange bleeding into blue. Planes rolled past like giants moving in a slow, distant rhythm. A soft hum filled the cabin. He didn't need to say anything to anyone else. The lesson had already begun to teach itself. His thoughts drifted, steady and measured, as if narrating not to the world, but to the quiet within himself. Respect isn't worn, he thought. It's earned. And it's recognized, if the one looking knows how to see it. People often mistook success for what could be seen, labels, status, curated profiles. But those were just reflections on water. Real substance lived beneath. The kind you couldn't fake, the kind you couldn't always recognize unless you learned to look deeper. He sipped the champagne slowly. It was fine. Cold. Crisp. Expensive. But not special. Not in the way people imagined first class made things special. Luxury, to him, wasn't a seat that reclined into a bed or a menu curated by a celebrity chef. It was being seen for who you were, no matter how quietly you carried your worth. He watched the ground crew outside as they loaded luggage. Moved with purpose. Often unnoticed, rarely thanked. Yet their work was no less essential than anyone seated in this cabin. His mind went to the developers he had mentored. The ones who didn't go to Ivy League schools, who wrote better code at midnight than most teams could deliver in daylight. People who were overlooked until someone finally paid attention, and then everything changed. It always came down to one thing: recognition. Not of titles or wealth, but of effort, of presence. He'd never built his company to be known. He built it to be useful. And yet, today had reminded him just how much the world still clung to the shallow surface. He turned his gaze toward the aisle. Across from him, a passenger shifted uncomfortably under his attention. A businessman, tailored and confident moments ago, now shrinking slightly, as if unsure whether to acknowledge him. John offered a brief nod. The man nodded back, too quickly, like someone trying to apologize without words. John didn't judge him. Everyone plays the role they're taught. The seatbelt light blinked on overhead. The pilot's voice echoed through the cabin, calm and practiced. The plane would soon leave the ground, but something heavier had already landed hours before. The quiet realization that perception is fragile, and truth doesn't always arrive wearing a name tag. As the plane rolled forward, John closed his eyes for a moment, not to sleep, but to breathe. He didn't need vindication. What mattered had already happened. The apology, the silence, the shift in posture from those who had once looked through him. Not because he'd revealed who he was, but because he'd stayed true to it. Somewhere over cloudline altitude, as the plane cruised in silence and the world shrank beneath them, John reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his phone. He didn't open the news or scroll through messages. He simply opened the camera. No filters, no angles, just the crumpled first-class boarding pass resting on the fold-out tray. The name clearly printed, John Ellis. He framed the shot, took it, and typed a caption, only 10 words. Sometimes, a little humility flies farther than you think. He pressed post and set the phone down. No hashtags, no call-out, no blame, just a whisper sent into the digital wind. He picked up his tea, leaned back, and closed his eyes. The storm began almost instantly. First, a quiet ping, then a buzz, then hundreds. Within the hour, the post had reached thousands. A few sharp-eyed tech workers recognized the name. A former employee of John's company commented, "This man built the aviation backbone." You've probably flown under his code. LinkedIn exploded first, then Twitter. Influencers latched onto the phrase, repurposing it over screenshots and reaction videos. Headlines followed. Tech billionaire denied boarding based on looks, response goes viral. The silent clapback that shook an airline. John Ellis and the power of being underestimated. The boarding pass photo became symbolic, shared alongside messages about dignity, class bias, and hidden greatness. Hashtags formed. Think pieces were published before the plane even landed. Former employees, students he had mentored, and CEOs who once ignored him all chimed in, some praising, others awkwardly apologizing for past oversight. One viral tweet read, "Imagine being the person who turned away the man whose software tells your flight when to land." The airline's official social media accounts flooded with tags and calls for accountability. Their replies went from routine to panicked. A generic apology was posted and quickly ratioed. The public wasn't asking for a refund. They wanted reflection. In a glass-walled conference room hundreds of miles from John's seat, executives sat in a hastily called meeting, eyes on a trending dashboard flashing red. Public sentiment was plummeting. Stock alerts pinged one after another. How did we not recognize him? One asked. It's not about who he is, another replied grimly. It's about how we treated him. Meanwhile, John remained unreachable. No online commentary. No interviews. No retaliation. He simply sipped his tea and watched the clouds roll by. Back in the digital world, creators crafted threads analyzing the post. Cultural critics dissected the incident as a mirror to how society assigns value. A major influencer recorded a video, her voice trembling. This isn't about tech. It's about how easily we judge people who don't perform well. That man could have yelled, demanded attention. Instead, he let the truth do the talking. The video reached 2 million views in a single day. That week, the airline's board released a statement promising bias training and internal reform. But most people had already drawn their conclusions. They hadn't just seen a man denied a seat. They saw themselves overlooked, underestimated, mislabeled. John's post hadn't screamed for attention. It had simply reminded the world that power doesn't need to prove itself, not when it's real. And in the eye of that digital hurricane, the man at the center of it all stayed quiet. Because he hadn't posted to go viral. He posted to make a point. And sometimes, a point is sharper when it whispers. The wheels touched down with a gentle jolt. The cabin stirred with the rustle of waking passengers, overhead bins creaking open, tired hands reaching for coats and carry-ons. First class emptied first, as it always did, but no one rushed ahead of John. He stepped off the plane without ceremony. No press. No entourage. Just the soft click of his soles on the jet bridge floor, the same quiet grace he'd carried through the entire journey. Outside the terminal, the morning air felt new. Crisp. Not because the world had changed, but because something inside it had been seen a little more clearly. A voice speaks not loudly, but with the calm certainty of truth. It's easy to judge by clothes, titles, or appearances, but real power never shouts. It simply walks in truth. The screen fades into a soft montage. In a training room tucked behind the airport's operations wing, airline staff sit in a circle, uniforms neat, notebooks open. A facilitator speaks gently about humility, unconscious bias, and the cost of assumption. Faces that once showed indifference now reflect something else, awareness. The gate attendant. She's quiet, pen in hand, eyes lowered in thought. On the table in front of her is a letter, half-written, heartfelt. She pauses, then continues, the strokes of her pen steadier now. In her own words, she writes not just to apologize, but to understand. Cut to a stream of everyday people, filmed in small snapshots. A young mother explaining how she was dismissed at a luxury store. A man recalling how he was ignored in a boardroom until someone else repeated his idea. A teenager sharing how his potential was measured by his shoes rather than his skills. Each story echoes the same undercurrent. We see only what we're trained to look for, and too often, we miss the rest. And then, the noise quiets again. John stands in front of a whiteboard, marker in hand. The classroom is modest, folding chairs, open laptops, a tangle of quartz. Yet the energy is electric. He's speaking to a room of young coders, some barely in their teens. Their eyes are locked on him, not because of who he is, but because of how he speaks. Simple, clear, empowering. He walks between rows, leaning over shoulders, nodding at lines of code, offering small suggestions. Not as a titan of industry, but as a guide, a mentor, a believer in potential where others might see none. A young girl raises her hand shyly. Her screen shows a program with an error message blinking at the top. John kneels beside her, smiles, and gently points out a missing bracket. Her eyes light up, not just because the code worked, but because someone like him believed she could make it work. This, for him, is the real first class. Not a seat, not a service. A space where worth isn't questioned. Where curiosity is met with encouragement, not skepticism. As the lesson winds down, the students gather around him. One of them, brave enough to ask, says, "Are you really the guy from the news?" John chuckles. "I'm just a guy who still remembers being underestimated." One by one, the lights in the classroom dim as students head out, voices buzzing with ideas. John remains for a moment longer, erasing the board slowly, thoughtfully. The voice returns, this time, as a closing thought rather than a statement. Be kind. You never know who's standing in line. If you enjoyed this story, ensure to like, share, and subscribe for more amazing, heartfelt stories like this. Also, let us know where you are watching from, and drop your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear from you.